All right, so this is the third in-person edition of A Glass with Gav. We are in Zurich, in between some presentations of yours. And so thanks for taking the time. Let's see what whiskey we're having today. It is the Kurayoshi Pure Malt Whiskey. 12-year-old.
Modest
Mostly. So you're currently on a university tour. I guess you're sort of in the laboratory developing over the last several years. Now you've created the specification for jam, join accumulate machine, and you're on a university tour. Can you tell us what inspired the decision to go on a tour of universities and what the goal is?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I was really in a lab for years, but yeah, I think the paper took about 6 or 7 months to get into its current state. And the idea of the tour is really to spread the understanding of what's in the paper. I mean, you publish a paper, and if people read it, one would hope that it's written sufficiently well that they can understand the concepts that it's introducing. But it's not always so easy. Writing is an imperfect art. So the point of the tour is to reinforce and explain those concepts, particularly for people that maybe don't want to read the 50, I think it's 61 pages now, of fairly dense mathematics.
And it's really hard to read.
I mean, I've tried to intersperse the maths with English language description of what's actually going on, but still, it's pretty dense. The university tour is for a sort of a good introduction, summary, and more of a hands-on explanation and the ability to answer questions. The idea is that each of the lectures is video, it's recorded, so that it can then be cut together at a future point to create a sort of educational resource, stitching various explanations and putting them in a sensible order.
Okay. And how many universities have you been to so far?
3.
And how many more are on this tour?
6.
And how many continents?
Maybe 7. How many continents? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5.
Only 5 continents.
Yeah,
don't think I've gone to
Australia yet.
Or Antarctica. There's no universities there anyway. Well, maybe for clarity, what is jam?
Well, jam is a protocol. And it's a protocol designed to get a better trade-off between the size that a blockchain system can grow and how coherent it is within itself. And to do so without giving up resilience, which is a quality that defines what Web3 systems are.
So coherent within itself means that it's all completely interoperable?
Yes, essentially.
Okay.
But interoperable in a way that is practical. What this basically means is that it is viable to have synchronous composition of its subcomponents, which is not something that is easy to do at scale, at least not without giving up resilience.
So I listened twice to your interview with Raoul Pal. It was a great conversation. And what struck me was the requirement or the necessity for transactions to be very, 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 very nearly free.
Yeah.
That have the right amount of varies, close enough, which is very far away from the state of the art at the moment.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the reality is that if you're forced to hold a cryptocurrency in order to transact on the system, that's that huge barrier to entry essentially limits your market to pre-existing cryptocurrency holders. And I can think of at least 2 ways to go where we can reduce that to the point where people that aren't necessarily cryptocurrency holders can utilize, can transact in these systems. But Jam is one of them. And the way that Jam does it is by essentially making the marginal cost of an additional transaction to be very nearly zero.
So how does one pay gas?
So if the system is not busy, one can probably say, well, the first bunch of computation that the system does can be free. Now, of course, someone can probably come along and eventually spam that. And so we have to have some cleverness at the sequencing stage. But ultimately, the closer we get to free, the less likely we need to force users to be pre-existing holders of cryptocurrency. Now, the other way of doing it is to identify individuals, or rather identify what an individual is. Don't necessarily need to identify specifically what their name is through KYC, but we may want to identify that this is an individual.
As in a person?
As in a person.
Okay, not as an AI agent.
Indeed, not as in software, because software is trivially multiplicatively. You can extend the number of software agents to very large numbers without paying a significant amount extra. That will almost certainly always beat the transactive marginal cost. Right? The marginal cost of adding another software agent will almost certainly always be less than the marginal cost of doing another transaction. And so we need something a bit stronger than software. So the device is not unreasonable. So we could imagine, for example, the marginal cost of registering a new SIM card probably is greater than the marginal cost of doing another transaction on Jam. And therefore, if we restrict people to unique SIM cards, that's one way of getting around this problem. But ideally, we can identify individuals and or identify the boundary of an individual. I don't mean that to say that anonymity should be removed or privacy should be removed, but rather that the ability to determine that this transaction is coming from an individual person and none of the other transactions are coming from the same person is a very useful thing to be able to do. And this can also help drive that transaction cost down to essentially zero.
And how close is this to reality?
I mean, things are being prototyped as we speak. I think we are close to having something that could be demonstrated. There have been some alterations to the Jam protocols
Already.
Oh, I mean, it's already it was always meant to be an evolution. The grey paper was versioned at 0.1, right? And we'd expect it to be launched at 1.0.
That was just a month ago.
Sure.
Roughly.
Yeah.
And it's already updated. So it's really active progress.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that it was updated with, I would hope, will be the last significant feature that's added, and everything else will be tweaks. I don't see the need to I don't want it to be a sort of an endlessly changing thing in the same way that sort of Ethereum 2 was this sort of years-long, endlessly changing proposition. There will always be better ideas in the future, but at some point you have to just sort of draw the line and say,
don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Can you mention what was the added feature? I understand it, but I have a chance.
I'll try and explain it. In essence, Polkadot and Jam have a concept of a distributed availability system. Now, what this is a way of storing data between many nodes such that you can reconstruct the data with a high degree of resilience, right? So you've got credible guarantees that for some period of time following, that data will be available. This is useful for doing things like storing all transactions, the state of accounts, and so on. You can put it in this data. You think of it as a giant hard disk that is shared, whose load is shared by everybody. And it's done using special cryptographic primitives, so that there is a very high chance of, when you want some particular piece of data, it's going to be available. It's going to be available very quickly. This is broadly known as distributed availability. With distributed availability, what we're trying to solve is very secure, resilient availability. So we're not relying on one particular person or node operator. Rather, the entire network takes a part in the storage. The specific way it works is we have 1,000 nodes, right, in Jam, on Osama and whatnot. We have 1,000 nodes, and we chop the data up into tiny little pieces, and we distribute one piece to each of the 1,000 nodes. The amount of data is cunningly multiplied by 3, so that we actually only need a third of the nodes to come back with their little piece. And it can be any third of the nodes.
Really?
And this means that even if 2/3 of the nodes go offline or are malicious, we can still reconstruct the data. And this gives us very strong guarantees that that data will be available when we need it, strong enough that we can store things like account balances. Because, of course, if you forget what the account balance is, you can't access that account anymore. Right. Those funds are lost, right? Until you can find what the account balance is again. And that's a problem. And it's a problem. I mean, account balance is a relatively small amount of information, but one can imagine the larger amounts of information that you still need to make sure are available in the future.
But there are like various spans of time that data needs to be available. So some audit, I'm just thinking of like corollaries, banking. Some data you need to keep for 5 years, some for 10 years, but presumably account information should need to be perpetual. Somebody might not access their account for 20 years. If it's a Swiss account, the family might not access it for 50 years, but they still think their gold is in the vault. Right?
I mean, for very, very long-term stuff, that's out of scope for Jam, because Jam is ultimately dealing with snapshots that are fast-moving. And if you want something that's stored beyond a month, say, then you would go out to some other provider of availability. But with Jam, what we're concerned about, but you're absolutely right in that there are different time horizons, and there are different time horizons in Jam as well. So there's a time horizon for auditing, and there is a time horizon for usage. Auditing generally happens in Jam within an hour. And actually, if the system is functioning in a regular fashion, within a few seconds, all the audits are completed, and we can be sure that the computation that we've done is correct, that we think we've done is correct. And so we keep data around for a few hours because we're overly cautious, so that, for it to be available for auditing, so that when some other node comes along and says, right, I want to audit this particular piece of computation, the data can be supplied to them. They can do the computation, and they can check the result and make sure the result is what it's meant to be.
Why?
This is part of the security of Jam. Yeah. So this is how Jam scales. It's how Polkadot scales as well. So in traditional systems like Ethereum 1 and most like monolithic blockchain designs, Solana would be another one, all nodes do all computation. So it's not very scalable. The only way it can scale is by scaling up, basically by making the nodes go faster. But of course, this has a limit. Eventually, your nodes become supercomputers, and the marginal cost for another validator joining the network becomes so high that the barriers to entry are essentially infinite. And then you just end up with an elite set of validators and all of the lack of resilience that brings. So much better than scaling up is scaling out, right? Basically bringing more nodes in, more operators in, and doing more work that way. But this brings with it a big problem. How do you split the work up? And once the work is split up, how do you recombine it? Because it's only through recombination that you can do composition. And this is a big problem the blockchain is facing right now. And you've seen, pioneer networks like Polkadot that were pioneering the idea of sharding, so splitting the data up, divide and conquer, split the data up, split the state up, but still secure everything under the same umbrella. This is all very well, but it brings a problem, which is composition. If the state is split up between different shards, then these are sort of independent subsystems. So it's easy enough for those subsystems internally to recombine their state and do all of the calculations and whatnot. If you want to, for a very simple example, if you wanted to do a transfer, just a simple balance transfer, if the accounts exist in the same shard, It's very simple. It's just the same as it would be in a monolithic system. But if that transfer wants to transfer balance from one shard from an account that lives in one shard to an account that lives in another, it becomes a lot more complicated. And we see this in Polkadot when you want to transfer balance from one parachain into an account on another parachain. It's even worse if you want to have one smart contract in one parachain interact with another smart contract in another parachain, because that's a more complex interaction. And so when you said earlier, it basically means interoperability across the whole ecosystem in a very fine-grained fashion. That's exactly what Jam is trying to help deliver. Basically making sure that these shards are not long-lived. So although the computation is split up, the actual data, the state, is still in one large data lake, but it can be drawn from and sort of recombined in a very agile fashion. And this is essentially the sort of feature that has been added to Jam, the ability to have this distributed availability system, which is basically the data lake, provide data and accept data in a very efficient and effective fashion, so that this computation that's done can sort of draw upon it very easily.
That sounds like a huge undertaking to be able to make the data available.
So thankfully, Polkadot's already done this. Okay. So the hard bit is actually already sorted, and this is why Polkadot took a long time to deliver, because you're right, it is a hard undertaking to do this, like splitting up the data up, sending it out, reconstructing it. It's a complex behavior that's undertaken by a lot of nodes, so it's a huge coordination. Jam really just utilizes this and adds to it the ability to basically not just push monolithic data blobs into the thing and accept monolithic and reconstruct monolithic data blobs back again a few hours later, but rather extends the time so that we now can have a 28-day later reconstruction. And it makes the blobs much smaller, which means that these blobs, we can pick and choose which bits of the data that we want to recombine. And this allows us to be much more agile in splitting our workload up and recombining it at a next time slice. So we still time slice, but each time slice is responsible essentially for splitting up this data lake, picking and choosing the bit, like partitioning it, taking a partition, doing some computation on it, like for example, transferring account balances, and then pushing it back into the data lake. So now we can see that if you want to transfer from, an account that's, we no longer have shards, we no longer have long-lived shards, which means the accounts don't live on a particular shard, they live in the data lake. And we can partition the data lake up as we choose, as is efficient, on a time to time, like basically 6 second to 6 second basis, which means probably most of the time, the same accounts will be pulled from the data lake and put on the same computation unit. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And the reason I say it would probably mostly be that way is because mostly people in the UK send money to people in the UK, right? So there does tend to be this sort of coherency, data coherency, but we have to make it also work well when that coherency isn't there. It should work maybe a bit better when it is there, but it should still work well when it's not there. And the problem with data sharded systems is that they work great when it is there, but they work really badly when it's not there.
So you've said sort of summer next year is when it would be ready to be deployed. This doesn't sound like it slows that down.
No, thankfully, most of the hard work is already done, hasn't it? So the engineering work, this sort of stuff that can often take, 3x or 5x as long as you expect, it's largely done. And what we do now is we sort of, modularize things a bit, pick and choose which bits we need, parameterize things, test things out, trial stuff on test systems, and really massage and sort of finesse. Never say never, but I would hope that within a few months we do come to a pretty stable version of the grey paper. Essentially, once we've properly dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's for this most recent change in the data availability system that really facilitates this massive amount of what we might reasonably call a sort of decentralized supercomputer.
Right. The promise of blockchain after Bitcoin. right? What Ethereum was marketed as,
Yeah,
more or less. I
Yeah.
still remember those
yeah,
videos.
yeah, yeah,
The windmill and
Quite.
yeah.
yeah.